Well, colleagues, would you take out your module booklet, this one, and open it up to page 3, please? Your module booklet, this one, it says on the front, 3, module 3. Okay, and open it up to page 3. I'm going to be dealing with, before morning tea, the fourth of the planned outcomes. This is planned. Doesn't mean to say it's going to happen, but it's planned. It says here that we're going to deal with refining understandings about the use of disciplined dialogue to explore the implications of data gathered on aspects of the Leadership for Literacy Learning Blueprint known to influence literacy learning. Now, I was really interested to hear the comment from, I think, the first or second table group that said the Leadership for Learning Blueprint was a bit iffy, right? I was really interested to hear that, because what I'm going to take you through in a moment hopefully will reinforce for you that while the framework is just a framework and there's no proprietorial interest over a framework, the dimensions within the framework are all compellingly research-based, every one of them. You can draw different diagrams, you can make different linkages, you can create different kinds of illustrative examples of the relationship between key conceptual domains that the literature and research of the meta-analytical kind that I introduced you to in Module 1 defines as the key components that connect the work of leaders with learning. Not the key components of anything else, just the key components that connect the work of leaders with learning. So leaders have got a broader purview than classroom teachers have, even though many of the dimensions with which leaders are concerned are also the dimensions with which teachers should be concerned. So in opening this particular session, I'll remind you of the positions that the PALL project has been based upon, and it's been unashamedly about a number of positions. The first of those positions says that principles make a difference. Now, you've heard that from a wide range of people. So there is compelling research evidence about leaders making a difference. So if you've got an enduring problem or a persistent problem in a school which is school-wide, even though there might be pockets of good practice in some classes, a change in that school trajectory is not something that occurs without talented leadership, without dedicated leadership. It just doesn't bubble up from 1 or 2 classroom teachers. So there's any amount of research evidence gathered together in those meta-analytical studies to reinforce that notion. In our particular case, we're working on literacy as a fundamental component in primary schools. So that's a position that it's a moral purpose we're on about. We're about improvement. We're not about making the lives of kids worse. And literacy, we know, is a critical component in improving the lives of young people. The second position says that there is a framework there again that is validated through multiple research reports into what it takes to learn to read. Anne went through with you the literacy wars, took a very balanced view as to where things ought to be positioned, and that as far as principals are concerned, principals don't need to know the fine-grained detail about every one of those matters, but the argument from the literature is that principals need to know enough to be able to see that these matters are addressed. So, if you were to go to the Leadership for Learning Blueprint, you would see that one of the things that principals would need to do that see that these matters are addressed is to concern themselves with the professional learning of staff, to see that staff know and understand these things. So this is a very important second position about literacy itself, and in this case, reading. The third position is what we're really on about today, that if there are going to be improvements in reading, then any interventions need to be based on evidence, and Anne will be spending quite a deal of time on the kind of diagnostic assessment that's necessary in order to understand where children are in order to take them on. Now, they're her words. I'm not going to say any more about that. She'll actually take you from that position through aspects of the Big Six. So that's today, looking at the building of interventions based on sound evidence about children's reading performance or achievement. So that's the third position. The fourth position is that this notion of leadership is clearly constructed out of the emerging literature, and I showed you that last time, where studies, certainly since 2006, have started to underscore the significance in settings such as ours, which are social and organisational. Leadership is not something that's seen as position. Leadership is something that must be seen as activity. Of course, positional leaders champion activity, don't they? And so you can't do the one without the other, but leadership must be seen as activity, and if there is something fundamentally important as a learning priority such as literacy, it has to be seen as a shared activity across the school. Now, if you go into the Leadership for Learning Blueprint, you'll find that under the shared leadership dimension that connects the work of leaders with learning, it says that leaders understand this and they organise accordingly. Leaders control the structural organisation of the school. Leaders organise accordingly. So it's a very important position that is part and parcel of this process. And the fifth one, and it was interesting to hear one of our colleagues over here talking about her own learning. I'm trying to help my staff learning here in terms of literacy and what we're doing, but of course as a leader I'm learning too. And the literature, again, from work such as that by Huber out of Switzerland, the Australian Institute for Teaching and School Leadership, Hallinger and others, shows very clearly that the professional learning of leaders is an applied field. It happens where you are. Today, you get open to some ideas, some challenges, you get exposed to some information, but it's not really the great learning site, is it? Look at us. We're here, we're listening, we're receptors, we're taking in, we're thinking about our context and what we might do, but the real learning for leaders takes place when the white-hot underbelly of practice is exposed to what the leader is attempting to champion or do. So authentic learning takes place over time, and in this particular case I think your own department's got to be applauded, because more often than not departmental people, bureaucrats, government, they want actually learning to be done now, tomorrow, and I want the effects on Tuesday. Now, it doesn't work like that in literacy learning, does it? And it certainly doesn't work when you're making changes in schools. So that's an important position to recognise and understand that's occurring in this PALL project over quite a considerable period of time for you. We're only up to Module 3. But it says you need to take things back with you, apply them in your own setting. The way you feel the knowledge of your setting will allow you to do so, because that's the ingredient that you have clear knowledge of as you try to take some research findings back into practice. This, I think, will be the way we need to do this in our location in order to make it work. So it's learning through action on the job, and that is underscored time and again in terms of leadership learning in school settings and in other settings for that matter. Okay, well, let me ask you then to take out the booklet, which is called Evidence and Ideas Gathering Techniques for School Leaders. That's in your pack. And I'm going to ask you to turn to page 4. Okay, what I'm going to concentrate on till morning tea is provide you with 3 or 4 examples of the kinds of data gathering that school leaders need to engage in order to inform themselves about aspects that are influential on learning and learning literacy and, of course, learning to read, but aspects which are influential. And those aspects come from the dimensions around that blueprint on page 4. So I'm going to take you through some data gathering related to the top one, professional development, and it'll be professional development about reading. I'm going to take you through some data gathering, if you go to the bottom right-hand corner, planning, coordinating monitoring the curriculum, teaching and learning across the school. You'll see more about that in a minute. And I'll have time, I think, to touch on probably one or two of the other dimensions. So if you look at page 5, you can see that it would even be possible for you to collect evidence about the strength of the evidence base that you use in the school. Anne's going to be spending a bit of time on that in terms of the evidence base that you use to collect information and data about children's reading, and particularly about children's reading across each of the elements of the Big Six. But if you look at the top right-hand side beside the little ellipse there, outstanding leaders of learning do these things. Now, are these a bit iffy? Or are these actual findings that are replicated and valid? They are findings from the meta-analytical search that I quoted for you in Module 1 that leaders do who make a difference to learning. And you'll see that that's picked up in our notion of interventions based on sound evidence. If you turn the page and go across to page 7, here's something that is possible for you to do. I showed you this in Module 1, possible for you to do to see whether or not you can gather some views about your teachers' understandings of aspects of what you claim to be what your school is about. We are about these things. Turn the page to page 8, and you can see that if you are a leader who wants knowledge about the participation in professional learning, you would do those things, and you might have a data gathering instrument like the one below that says, oh, here are some comprehension strategies. What can I actually find out from my teachers about their confidence levels to undertake these strategies, whether they are confident or not yet confident? So there are simple and systematic ways for you to get an understanding across your school, particularly if your school's got a number of teachers. Small schools, of course, these things can be parts of conversations around a table. If you go to the next page, page 9, I've given you an account where it's possible to use qualitative data to have conversations about aspects of, say, the emotional or social conditions of learning. I take you through to, you don't need to read these, I'm just pointing them out for you because I've used these for you in Module 1. If you come to page 13, here's a very good example of trying to gather some understanding of what teachers think about their orientations to teaching and learning. And you'll find that that particular exercise, which we had a practice at in Module 1, is just there to remind you that down in that element of coordinating and understanding curriculum, teaching and learning, there is a need for you from time to time to gather information about what is happening amongst teachers. Go over the page to page 16. The one area in the PALL pilot project and in work that's been done since, and in work that has been reported by Jacobson and others, another paper that I referred you to in Module 1, the biggest difficulty that we've still got is making connections beyond the school in support of reading, particularly for readers who are struggling. And so those are the kinds of things that are done not just with parents and families, but are done in the search of getting support from a wider body of people from the community to assist in supporting children's learning. Go to page 17 and you can see some examples of some questions that were drawn from a study in Scotland, the kinds of questions that are asked of parental involvement to see the extent to which leaders of schools need to know and understand how well or otherwise there are aspects of parental support for learning. Turn to page 19. I've said that leadership needs to be shared. Our literature and research is pointing us all in that direction. Well, what sort of shared leadership do you have in your school? In this particular example, there are 3 different types that are often used. If you can look at it there, you can, in the middle of the page, dispersed leadership. Dispersed leadership just arises. It happens when somebody says, well, I'll have a crack at this. I'll try this. Not necessarily something that is identified and defined by the principal or the leader of the school as something that needs to be done. It may just arise. Then you've got delegated leadership. Again, the research literature shows that you'll often need to move through delegation before you ultimately reach real sharing of leadership. People have to be tapped on the shoulder if you're going to restructure things appropriately. Well, what examples of delegation do you have before you move into examples of shared leadership, which you can see is about groups of people who have particular responsibilities, taking those responsibilities forward because you've structured the opportunities for them to so do, but they take it forward. So these are the kinds of elements or the kinds of processes that a school leader can use to try to inform him or herself about important influences on learning. Now, I've just given you a quick run through to say leaders need to be thinking about those dimensions of learning in whichever way you want to construct your framework to make sure that as leaders you're systematically addressing known components that make a contribution to learning. So let me just take you to the first exercise I'm going to get you to do, because I'm going to ask you to address the very first paper that you've got in your pack. This is not something you need to read. In your pack you've got an instrument that has been prepared by a principal that deals with the literacy agreements that the school, following the PALL modules 1 and 2, produced. Yes, it's the bright green colour. Take the bright green one. I'll take that one. Okay, I'd like you to have the bright green one on your table. Let me explain it to you, because I'm going to ask you to have a conversation about this for around about 15 minutes maximum. This was a school in which there are 14 teachers, and they completed this survey on what the school had produced as standards of literacy teaching. They had an agreement. I've heard a couple of teachers talking about, a couple of principals talking about what it is that we are raising as our expectations for literacy teaching and learning in our school. Well, this particular school in the PALL project, you'll see it's a South Australian school, actually produced this set of literacy agreements. I wonder if the school's here, I don't know. It's from a past school, but it could be that a principal is here from it. What I would like you to do is to examine the data that has been collected by the principal, and I would like you to have a conversation about what it is telling you, and then spend a little time identifying what you might do with it. If you were in that school, what would you do with it? What would you do with these data? Once you have spent about 10 minutes on seeing what it is telling you. So you're using that discipline dialogue question, what are we seeing in these data? Okay? I will show you at the end of the conversation what the principal saw in the data and what the principal agreed in the school with the staff they were going to do about it. All right? So you've got about 10 minutes to, maybe a little longer, to talk about what you see in these data, and then I'll give you a little bell and then say, well, what would you do having seen what you've seen? Okay? About 10 minutes or a little longer for that conversation. Would you spend just 5 minutes now, but concentrating on what would you do with that particular set of data if you had it as a leader? So would you share that around your table? What would you do with it? How would you make use of it, given that one of the positions on which this program is based is the concept of shared leadership? What would you do if that was a data set that you had gathered, given that clearly the staff has had some contribution to the list of agreements that are there? Their standards. They've had some contribution to that. So how would you use those data? And we'll take a couple of comments where Leonie will rove with the microphone to get a couple of tables that haven't talked to say how you might use these data back as a leader within your school. Leonie's looking now for just two tables to tell us what they would do with these data if they had them. There's a table here where there's a lot of pointing going on.
They're fighting over it.
Yep.
Who wants to talk? We were just having lots of conversations about the difference in categories of schools, because some of us are from category 7s, and the difference is staff thinking when they don't really need to necessarily pull together to survive, whereas some of our other counterparts on the table are from lower socio-economic schools, and so there's often a quicker need to be working closely together. I mean, that's a bit of a generalisation.
Did anybody really address the question, how might you use these data if you had collected them?
Has anyone addressed the question here? Oh, come on. No. Good.
There we go. Somebody's addressed the question.
I thought it'd be a good tool to use for a pre and a post review on your whole school agreements.
So this agreement is not something that is novel to you. You've seen agreements like this. Okay, and some of you would have agreements like this in your school that you've constructed over a period of time. This is a South Australian one, anonymised in the PALL pilot report. But let me tell you how you might use this if you were trying as a leader to be systematic about these data. I mean, basically a discipline dialogue approach says you really got to get to know what's in the data, and there's too much here. There's too much here to get to know it just in one hit. So my suggestion to you would be, if you've got data like this, there are the first two standards, 1 and 2, that really do relate to the overall purposes of the program. And I would pull those out, and I would try to do something in terms of what that's telling me just for standards 1 and 2 that are there. The next group, 3, 4, 5, 6 and possibly 7, all go together because they're all related with teaching and learning, they're related with planning for teaching and learning, the nature of pedagogy and what we think are high-yield strategies, consistency in assessment, and the intervention that's built on the kinds of assessment strategies we use to get differentiation. So I'd be pulling out the stuff that is clearly focused on classrooms and trying to tabulate that in a way that is easier to manage than seeing it all on this particular sheet. The last two elements, professional development and classroom environment, they could be taken separately or they could be taken together. I would then suggest that if one's operating an approach to shared leadership, that I would be giving the teachers the opportunity to identify what it is that they would come up with against those particular clusters of data that have been put out in front of them. I would have formed my view, no doubt about that, I would have formed my view about what it seems to be telling me, because as a leader of the school, there's a great advantage that you have over a classroom teacher. You see the totality. They don't necessarily see the totality. So you see what is occurring across the school and have a view of where a particular position that's taken by a teacher on information or data that's prepared like this would be. Let me show you what the principal formed a view about him. It was a himself. I'm not sure that you can read that right down the back there. Perhaps I should just read it so that those people at the back can hear. So this is the principal's summary. It's an extract from the summary. It was much more extensive than this, but I've just taken an extract. It would appear that staff in general range from being moderately confident to very confident regarding their understanding of each of the literacy agreements. Given the inexperience of the staff, here's context knowledge, here's discipline dialogue question number 2, why are we seeing what we are, isn't it? Why are we seeing what we are? Given the inexperience of the staff, they are very much in the developing phase of their careers, and this response was entirely predictable. He's talking to himself. Of particular note in these data are the following. Now you'd have to ask yourself why the principal has picked these things out, because I'll bet you picked out different things from this principal. Some are the same, but perhaps different things. Of particular note in these data are the following. 1, a good number of staff are at the higher end of confidence in relation to staff class environment. Maybe there's been some attention paid to that. 2, a firm commitment has been made to the time expectation for literacy teaching and learning. 3, explicit teaching has been identified as an area of strength. 4, the sharing of practice is highlighted, attributed to the focus upon activities during FPD to foster disciplined dialogue between teachers. Continued areas for improvement have been selected by the principal. Preventing interruption during literacy lessons, consistent approaches to intervention, implementation of a broader range of higher yield practices, and awareness raising about targets and detail within the site improvement plan. So that's what that principle has identified. Now, the question still remains, and it is begged, what does the principal do even though the principal has formed those views? If you're taking a shared leadership approach, there's clearly got to be some degree of buy-in by the teachers to the areas of improvement, so they're going to need to be engaged with these data in order to be able to come up with improvement focuses with which they will be engaged. There needs to be a way of utilising the data in a collective sense. So clearly, with a focus on shared leadership, structuring the opportunity and organising accordingly to deal with data, following disciplined dialogues, discussions about it, is an important aspect for leaders to undertake. This particular example throws up a lot of questions for that notion of what I do as leader and what my expectation is for the shared leadership approach that we want to adopt in the school. So let me move into the next example. It is in your packs and it is in the blue, the light blue coloured sheet. This is actually a sample of 14 teachers who answered questions about the allocation of their teaching to whole class, to target group and to individuals. What I would like you to do is to have a focused discussion around the questions you see on the sheet. I'm going to give you about 10 minutes for this. What would the purpose of these data gathering, this data gathering process have been? How would you have structured the instrument? Would you have done it the same or would you have done it differently? How and by whom would the data have been processed? And as a school leader, what arrangements would you have made for the discussion of the results? If you do nothing else, I'd like you to concentrate on one, that is the first question and the last question, all right? The first and the last. So you've got about 10 minutes to look at those data and determine what you would do once you have identified the purpose, what you might do with these data. I will just draw you back to the booklet called Evidence Gathering Techniques that I started to show you examples from, this one. And I would just ask you to have beside you page 4, which is the Leading Learning Framework. Because out of the 2 examples you've had a look at so far, I've given you one example that actually makes a data set about issues that might be considered for the top dimension, active participation in professional learning, and I've given you with that first bright green exercise matters that relate to teaching, so the curriculum, teaching and learning dimension on the bottom right-hand side. So it's data gathering about those dimensions. In this particular case, the light blue sheet gathers some data about the conditions of learning, which is over on the right-hand side. The conditions of learning are about the physical, social, emotional conditions of learning. The physical conditions of learning, you really need to think always about 4 things. It's people, equipment, 5, people, equipment, materials, funds and time. They're all resources, aren't they? People, equipment, materials, funds and time. This is about time. And if you look at the purpose here, this is a female principal. Clearly they've organised in the PALL project some time to be spent on wave 1, wave 2 and wave 3 kinds of planning, and it means there'll be some whole class work and there should be attention paid to that, some targeted group work and perhaps some individualised work. But if you recollect what Anne was talking about in Module 2, wherever possible, classroom activity of the whole class kind should be what is exhausted first before one moves to other things. It's in order to actually protect the resource of people and opportunity, isn't it? So, clearly there's a purpose to try to understand. I was talking to this table group over here. This is a nice principle, because the principal has just aggregated the data and said, let's have a discussion about the use of time across the school, hasn't she? She hasn't actually said, what are you doing in year 2? And she hasn't said, what are you doing in year 7? She might have a view about who these 1 or 4 or 7 teachers are on the 0 to 19%. She might have some idea about those people, but she hasn't actually pulled them out to expose it. It's a tool to have a discussion about the relationship between the time that is applied to particular kinds of teaching organisation. So what arrangements would you make for the discussion of the results? It's a critical question for school leaders. If it's a shared leadership approach that you're seeking, then you may decide to discuss the results in clusters of teachers within your school, if your school is large enough. If it's a smaller school, you might want to have it as a round table discussion. And ultimately, as I said to you right on day one, this generic strategy of conducting disciplined dialogue gives you a capacity for relational development with staff. It gives you a capacity to concentrate on the data, not the person. And when the relational elements of discussion have built sufficient rapport, when these kinds of data are put in front of teachers for a discussion with you as leader, they actually self-disclose. They self-disclose. That's what I'm doing. I'm doing that. I'm not doing that. Well, I think I should be doing a bit more of this, but I'm not at the moment. Ultimately, the relational component of dealing with data is a very important underpinning to getting the buy-in and getting people to understand where they need to go next. So it's a critical matter for leaders to think about the how of using the data, not just the gathering of data. And if you accept from the leadership research the generic nature of disciplined dialogue to employ leaders thinking with others about the use of data, then you start to make traction on important matters that are sufficiently important enough for you to have wanted to collect some data about them. Okay, let's go from teachers to this orangey coloured sheet, which is an example that it's down in the curriculum teaching and learning dimension. I'll give you the principal's response to what that previous one was about. Example number 2, and I'll have to read it. I'm sorry about this. It's such a huge room, isn't it? The data show that the main form of instruction is towards the whole class. That's just a straight descriptive statement, isn't it? Okay. 2, this is attributed to the I do phase of the lesson cycle that is encouraged, if not indeed expected. 3, target group teaching in reading is primarily at the 20% to 40% level and can be attributed to guided reading methodology. 4, individual teaching comprises provision of feedback and one-to-one instruction conferencing, which constitutes the you-do part of the lesson cycle at around 1/5 of the total instruction time. Now that's the principal's description of what's there. The principal actually didn't go on in that report to say what she was doing about it with the staff. But clearly the description will lead to something that can be affirmed or can be recommended, won't it? And it's how you use that to compose the questions that becomes the important leadership challenge. All right, let me take you to this third one, which is the orange sheet. And I would like you in this particular instrument to have a look at what has been collected here. It's about the Blueprint Dimension Curriculum and Teaching, and the teacher has conducted this with the class. You'll probably feel uncomfortable that the word neutral has been used, years 3 to 7, but you can see the description of what the instrument was that the principal employed, and I'd like you to examine the data that is there, but then ask yourself how you might add value to it, or in fact do it a little differently. So I'll give you about 5 or 7 minutes for that. And a couple more things to do before morning tea. You're probably getting a bit ravenous. This particular item, I was listening at a table. I'm not going to pull up items from your tables for this so we can keep moving on. But the table thought that this was a pretty good piece of work from the principal. The principal had done some good work. There were ways in which it can certainly be improved, and the table group suggested that there were elements in here that are clearly reflective of important aspects of teaching and learning that Hattie would have attached a 0.4 or better effect size to. So a better instrument in the view of that table was to take this, turn it over after the data are in, and show the important elements which create significant effect sizes and see where the data are with respect to those. They liked the notion that there was a breakup and that students were being asked. We didn't comment on the neutral thing, did we? At all. The neutral category is a bit hard, isn't it? I could use some better words for that. But the other thing that has come out there is that there's some ambivalence about the significant role that feedback plays on this group of teachers, isn't there? So while they're fixing up incorrect words, by and large, there is some, how can I say, some division, some variability with respect to work being marked and commented upon, and teachers telling students the processes to improve their learning. So there are important aspects there which relate to the key role that feedback plays in learning that could be strengthened in an instrument like this. But this principal has had a crack at producing an instrument with his or her teachers, and again made it such that it is about the issue rather than about the individual. So at some point through your performance management process you get to the individual, don't you? But in order to produce aspects of shared leadership that you want to champion, you need to be able to keep teachers together on that process of dealing with the issues, getting them to the point where ultimately they want to self-disclose and put up their hand about what they may need and what they're not yet confident in and what they could be doing differently. This is what the principal said about this, and I'll just read it for you. Principal summary of this example. The use of graphic organisers to pre-plan scaffold written tasks requires improvement. It's just gone straight to the chase, this particular principle. The use of explicit written feedback, a regular experience for 70%, requires improvement. However, verbal feedback is a regular experience for 83% of respondents, and spelling correction is experienced by 92%. 74% of respondents experience teaching of pre, during, post-reading strategies. This requires improvement. 59 students, 90% highlighted commitment and engagement to tasks. This requires improvement. Whole group instruction, group task and individual instruction are experienced across the year levels. Okay? Let's then just look at your last example before morning tea. And this one is the buff-coloured sheet, and it's got two parts to it because there was the question that was associated with the teachers 8 teachers on the first page, and then the instrument was accompanied by something that the principal had collected himself about students that were sent to the office. So I'd like you to have a look at those 2 data sets and ask yourself at least 1 or 2 of the questions in this last 5-minute or so discussion. The data's not extensive, so you should be able to have a look at it reasonably quickly. Here's the principal summary of those 2 data sets. Results from the staff survey show significant shifts in effective use of scope and sequence resources. In February, half the staff disagreed with the statement, "I effectively use scope and sequence resources," and in September this dropped to 7%. Strong agreement with this item increased from 33% in February to 67% in September. Student behaviour data. Results indicate that prior to the commencement of the literacy block, more students, that is 28, were sent to the office than at any other time of the day. After 1 term, twice as many students, 24, were sent to the office during literacy blocks than at other blocks in a day, and after 2 terms, that is by the end of 2010, slightly fewer students were sent to the office during literacy blocks. By term 3, 2011, the number of students sent to the office during literacy blocks were about half the number sent during other times of the day. So the principal's kept his own little list. Now, somebody said to me walking past, "I wonder how many those kids are the same." Okay, let me then just finish off before morning tea to say that what I've done is to take you around 3 dimensions of the Leadership for Learning framework, saying that if you're going to gather data that supports learning, you will gather data, important data, about aspects of those dimensions. You've got a couple of other things here just before we finish. In the light mauve sheet is a very interesting example of one principal's identification of 3 important elements of literacy learning. On the mauve sheet, you'll see at the top of the page in bold that this principal wants the staff to think about the children's attitude, their engagement, and literacy improvement itself, and gathering the children's views about these matters. And you can see the items that the staff in that school has produced on attitudes to the extra support that they were getting as students who were having some targeted intervention. These were known as Wave 2 students, having some targeted intervention. There were 79 of them. That's a heck of a lot of kids getting some particularly explicit teaching in a structured way. And then you've got engagement in learning. Some very interesting items that the staff has put together there with the principal. And the last one, literacy improvement, that is the student's view of what he or she thinks about things. Now, in this particular case, I know that this school actually piloted those items with some kids as a cold. They cold piloted them, see what the kids could understand them. There's slightly better usage of words there that children react to than in the instrument that I showed you that had neutral in it, for example. So that's a very useful little tool, and of course they've used some graphic organisers to help display the data for discussion. The last one that I want to show you, the second last one that I want to show you, is the sheet that the next sheet in the pack, which is just the survey of teachers at School F. This particular principal just used the Leadership for Literacy Blueprint and asked the teachers to rate the A3 sheet the same as you had a crack at in your Module 1. You know, the A3 sheet that had the blueprint in the middle of it, and asked you to rate it. The principal ran that with the staff, but look, has run it in 4 groups. P to 1, years 2 and 3, years 4 and 5, and years 6 and 7. So this is actually isolating groups of teachers a little more closely than all of the other examples I've given you. I've given you examples which are more whole staff friendly than individual teacher identifiers. This is getting a little closer to where there might be particular strengths or there might be particular differences. If you come to the last one, the pink sheet, and then we'll break. This is a principal and staff having a first pass at what they might use as questions to gather information from parents. Now, there are many examples of this, and I know that you've all got parent satisfaction surveys and so on, but if you're talking about reading improvement, what are the kinds of questions that you would ask if you're trying to engage your parents and get some understanding of the way in which they may relate to the school, to their teacher, and to the reading improvement processes that you're wanting to put in place? So that's just a draft start, and I wanted to put that down there to show you that schools, principals, teachers have to start somewhere. Sometimes the start is made by the principal, sometimes the start can be made as you structure it, small committee working on this. We need to know more about what the kids are thinking. We need to know about it across the school. Let's have a shared leadership across the school dimension. Somebody from the lower, middle and upper school, let's have a pass at doing that together to begin with as we collect information about our professional learning, what we're doing in curriculum, what the children are experiencing in their learning, or the conditions of learning, or our own shared leadership for that matter. Okay, so I'm hoping that you're seeing that those things which make a contribution to learning from the point of view of actions by principals are just as worthy of selective data gathering for more systematic attention to be given to them, as is the material that Anne will present to you, because she's going into the bottom right-hand dimension of the Leadership for Learning framework, that is the monitoring of teaching and learning and achievement. And she'll be looking particularly at assessment for learning, but diagnostic assessment, in order to be able to build a basis of knowledge from which to plan ultimately for better focused teaching and learning for kids, and clearly later on for the interventions that will be necessary for some. Thank you.